There is a state in America where you can stand on a mountaintop at sunrise, drive east through rolling farmland, cross a tidal estuary older than the Atlantic seaboard's oldest cities, pass through one of the wealthiest suburbs on Earth, enter one of the poorest large cities in the country, and reach the ocean before the sun goes down. That state is smaller than most people's mental image of it. It is barely 2 miles wide at its narrowest point, and yet packed inside its borders, you will find almost every contradiction that defines the United States. North and South, black and white, wealth and poverty, tolerance and exclusion, federal power and forgotten towns, coastline and high ridge, future and past. Most states contain a version of America. Maryland contains all of them. Compressed into a space so small it should not be able to hold them, but it does. And that compression is not an accident, it is the entire story. To understand Maryland, you have to begin with the land itself, because the land came first, and the land is strange. If you look at a map of the lower 48 states, most of them have shapes that make a kind of geographic sense. They follow rivers, they follow parallels, they follow mountain ridges, or political compromises drawn with a straight edge. Maryland follows almost nothing. Its borders look like the result of an argument that was never fully resolved. The northern boundary is the Mason-Dixon line, one of the most famous surveyed borders in history, drawn in the 1760s to settle a dispute between the Penn and Calvert families. The southern and western edges follow the Potomac River as it curves and bends through the Appalachian foothills. And then there is the Chesapeake Bay, which does not form a border at all, but cuts directly through the middle of the state like a wound that never closed. The result is a shape that looks from above like a broken hand reaching toward the sea, and that shape is not just cartographic trivia, it created separate worlds. Start in the far west in Garrett County, and you are standing above 2,900 feet in the Allegheny Plateau, surrounded by spruce forests and snowfall totals that rival parts of New England. The culture here leans toward Appalachia. The accents are different. The economy was built on timber and coal. The towns feel closer to West Virginia than to anything east of the Blue Ridge. Move east, and you descend through the Ridge and Valley Province, where long parallel folds of ancient rock run like ribs from northeast to southwest. Cross the Blue Ridge at South Mountain, and the terrain opens into the Piedmont, a wide belt of rolling farmland and suburban expansion that stretches toward Baltimore and Washington. Cross that corridor and you reach the coastal plain, where the land flattens and the rivers slow and widen into tidal creeks. And then you reach the bay. The Chesapeake is roughly 200 miles long, the largest estuary in the United States, and one of the largest in the world. It is shallow in most places, rarely more than 20 or 30 feet deep, but its surface area is enormous. More than 150 rivers and streams drain into it, and when you cross it, heading east, you arrive on the eastern shore, a flat, quiet agricultural peninsula shared with Delaware and Virginia, where the rhythm of life is governed by tides, seasons, and the memory of a world that once moved almost entirely by water. All of this exists inside a single state that ranks 42nd in total area. You could fit Maryland inside Montana more than 10 times over. And yet Montana does not contain half the geographic variety that Maryland holds. This variety did not happen by chance. It was shaped by deep time. The Appalachian Mountains in Maryland's west are among the oldest mountains on Earth, remnants of collisions between tectonic plates hundreds of millions of years ago, long since eroded into soft green ridgelines. The Piedmont was formed from the roots of those ancient ranges, a belt of metamorphic rock smoothed by time, and the coastal plain, including the land surrounding the Chesapeake, is geologically young, built from sediments deposited over millions of years as the sea advanced and retreated. The bay itself is even younger, about 10,000 years ago. As the last ice age ended and glaciers melted to the north, sea levels rose and flooded the lower valley of the Susquehanna River. What had been a freshwater river valley became a saltwater estuary, and its tributaries turning into the tidal inlets and marshes that now define the eastern shore. The Chesapeake is, in geological terms, a drowned river, and that drowning created one of the most productive and contested bodies of water in North America. It also created a dividing line that would shape Maryland's identity for centuries, because the bay did not just separate land, it separated people. Long before Europeans arrived, the Chesapeake region was home to Algonquian-speaking peoples, including the Piscataway and the Nanticoke, who lived along its tributaries and harvested its extraordinary abundance of fish, oysters, and waterfowl. When English colonists arrived in the early 17th century, they found a landscape of almost unimaginable biological richness. The bay teemed with life, the forests were dense, and the rivers were navigable deep inland, and the soil along the coastal plain, particularly in southern Maryland and the lower eastern shore, was ideal for tobacco, a crop that would define the colony's economy and, eventually, its moral catastrophe. Maryland was founded in 1632 when King Charles I granted a charter to Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore. The Calvert family was Catholic, and at the time, English Catholics faced severe legal restrictions and social persecution in their own country. The colony was, in part, a business venture designed to generate wealth from the tobacco trade and land rents. But it was also something rarer, a deliberate attempt to create a place where Catholics could practice their faith without interference. This did not mean Maryland was founded as a paradise of universal freedom. It was not. The Calverts were aristocrats. They expected to govern, they expected to profit, and the colony's economy from its very first years depended on indentured servants and increasingly on enslaved Africans. But within the narrow terms of its time, the Maryland experiment was remarkable. In 1649, the Colonial Assembly passed the Act Concerning Religion, sometimes called the Toleration Act, which guaranteed freedom of worship to all Christians who accepted the doctrine of the Trinity. It was not full religious liberty by modern standards. It excluded Jews, it excluded non-Trinitarians, and it carried severe penalties for blasphemy, but it was one of the earliest legal protections for religious conscience in the English-speaking world, and it reflected something genuinely unusual about Maryland's founding vision, the idea that people of different beliefs could share the same colony without destroying each other. That vision did not last. Within a generation, the very Catholics the colony was meant to protect found themselves on the losing side of political upheavals tied to England's own religious conflicts. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Protestant settlers seized control of the colony's government, and the Calverts were stripped of their governing authority for decades. By the early 18th century, Catholics in Maryland faced many of the same legal disabilities they had fled England to escape. They could not hold public office. They could not vote. They could not openly build churches. The colony that had been founded as a refuge became, for its founders' own community, a place of quiet exclusion. This reversal is not a footnote, it is a template. It's because Maryland would repeat this pattern again and again across the centuries. A place that promises one thing and delivers its opposite. A place where idealism and betrayal coexist so closely they become almost indistinguishable. As the colonial period gave way to the Revolutionary era and then to the early Republic, Maryland's geography continued to sort its population into distinct worlds. The southern counties and the lower eastern shore remained tied to plantation agriculture, tobacco, and later, grain. These regions depended heavily on enslaved labor, and their social structures mirrored those of Virginia and the Carolinas. Large estates, hierarchical communities, an economy built on the forced labor of black men, women, and children. By the time of the first federal census in 1790, Watts's enslaved people made up roughly a third of Maryland's total population, and in some southern counties, the proportion was far higher. Meanwhile, the western counties looked different. The farms were smaller, the terrain was rougher. The settlers had come not from the tobacco coast of the Chesapeake, but from Pennsylvania, from the Shenandoah Valley, from Germanic and Scots-Irish traditions that emphasized family labor and subsistence farming over plantation monoculture. These Western Marylanders had more in common with their neighbors in Pennsylvania and what would eventually become West Virginia than with the planter class of St. Mary's or Talbot counties. Maryland, in other words, was not one society. It was two, maybe three, layered on top of each other within a single colonial border. And nowhere was that layering more intense than in Baltimore. Baltimore was not part of the original colonial plan. It was incorporated in 1729, relatively late compared to Maryland's earliest settlements along the bay, but its location gave it an extraordinary advantage. Sitting at the head of the Patapsco River, near the fall line where the Piedmont meets the coastal plain, Baltimore had access to both the agricultural hinterland of the interior and the maritime trade routes of the Chesapeake. It became a port city, a milling center, a shipbuilding hub. By the late 18th century, it was one of the fastest growing cities in North America, and it was something else too, a place where the line between North and South blurred into near invisibility. Baltimore's merchants traded with the Caribbean and the Deep South, dealing in tobacco, sugar, and the products of enslaved labor. But the city's shipyards and factories also attracted free black workers, European immigrants, and the kind of wage labor economy associated with northern industrial cities like Philadelphia and New York. Baltimore was, in a sense, a borderland compressed into a single city. It contained northern ambitions and southern entanglement simultaneously. This duality would become violently visible when the country finally broke apart. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Maryland was immediately caught in the most dangerous position of any state in the Union. Washington, D.C., the federal capital, sits on land that was originally carved from Maryland. The district is bordered by Maryland on 3 sides. If Maryland had seceded, the capital of the United States would have been surrounded by Confederate territory, cut off from the northern states that supplied its soldiers and its revenue. President Lincoln understood this with absolute clarity. Maryland had to stay in the Union, but Maryland did not want to stay quietly. On April 19th, 1861, just days after the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, Union troops from Massachusetts marched through Baltimore on their way to defend Washington. A crowd of Confederate sympathizers confronted them. Stones were thrown, then shots were fired. Soldiers and civilians fell in the streets. It was one of the first lethal confrontations of the war, and it revealed that Baltimore was not a safely Union city. It was a city at war with itself. Lincoln responded with measures that remain among the most controversial executive actions in American history. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland, authorized the detention of suspected secessionists without trial, and stationed federal troops throughout the state. Maryland's legislature was closely watched, and some of its members were detained to prevent a vote on secession. The state remained in the Union, but its loyalty was, in many ways, compelled rather than chosen. And here is the contradiction that makes Maryland's Civil War story uniquely revealing. Maryland stayed in the Union, but slavery remained legal within its borders for most of the war. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, it freed enslaved people only in Confederate states, not in border states like Maryland that had remained loyal. Enslaved people in Maryland were not freed by federal decree. They were freed by a new state constitution, narrowly approved by Maryland voters in 1864, in an election shaped by the absence of Confederate sympathizers and the presence of Union soldiers at polling places. Even the act of ending slavery in Maryland was tangled in ambiguity and force. After the war, Maryland did something remarkable with its state flag. The flag that flies today combines 2 heraldic designs, the black and gold Calvert arms and the red and white Crossland arms. During the war, Unionists had used the Calvert banner. Confederate sympathizers had adopted the Crossland cross botany as their symbol. After the conflict ended, the 2 designs were joined into a single flag, quartered together. A visual act of reconciliation that acknowledged both sides without fully repudiating either. No other state flag in America carries this kind of symbolism so explicitly. It is a banner of duality, a stitching together of opposites, and it remains one of the most distinctive and popular state flags in the country, instantly recognizable, widely reproduced on clothing and merchandise, and deeply embedded in Maryland's sense of itself. The flag does not resolve the contradiction, it displays it, and in that, it is a perfect emblem for the state it represents. The decades after the Civil War brought industrialization, urbanization, and a slow remaking of Maryland's economy. Baltimore grew into one of the great industrial cities of the East Coast, with steel mills, canneries, garment factories, and one of the busiest ports on the Atlantic seaboard. The city attracted waves of immigrants: Germans, Poles, Italians, Greeks, Ukrainians, and many others, each group settling into distinct neighborhoods that gave Baltimore its famously parochial, block-by-block character. At the same time, the Eastern Shore remained agricultural, quiet, and increasingly remote from the centers of power and wealth gathering on the western side of the bay. Western Maryland, tied to the railroad and the coal trade, developed its own economy and its own sense of regional identity. The state was modernizing, but it was not converging. Its parts were growing at different speeds, in different directions, connected by geography but separated by experience. Then came the transformation that made modern Maryland. After World War II, the federal government expanded on a scale that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. New agencies, new military installations, new research laboratories, new intelligence facilities, all of them needed land, buildings, and workers, and many of them were built in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. The National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, the Food and Drug Administration in Silver Spring, the Census Bureau in Suitland. The list goes on. Montgomery Montgomery County and Prince George's County, the two Maryland counties that border Washington most directly, became the epicenter of this federal expansion, and they were remade by it. Suburbs multiplied, office parks rose from former farmland, the population swelled with scientists, engineers, analysts, lawyers, contractors, and civil servants, people drawn not by Maryland itself, but by the gravitational pull of the federal government just across the district line. This transformation made Maryland, by the numbers, one of the most prosperous states in the nation. For years, Maryland has ranked at or near the top of all states in median household income. Montgomery County, in particular, is routinely listed among the wealthiest counties in the United States. The educational attainment of Maryland's population is among the highest in the country. The state's economy is anchored by sectors that tend to be recession-resistant: government, defense contracting, healthcare, biotechnology, cybersecurity, and higher education. On paper, Maryland looks like a success story, a small state that leveraged its proximity to power into broad-based affluence. But the paper does not tell the full story. Because roughly 40 miles northeast of the manicured campuses of Bethesda and the secure compounds of Fort Meade, there is Baltimore. Baltimore in the 21st century is a city of staggering contrasts. The Inner Harbor, redeveloped in the 1980s and 1990s, gleams with waterfront hotels, museums, and restaurants. Johns Hopkins University and its affiliated hospital system form one of the most prestigious medical research complexes in the world, employing tens of thousands of people and attracting talent from every continent. The neighborhoods around the harbor and the university campuses are vibrant, well-maintained, and increasingly expensive, but drive 10 minutes in almost any direction from these anchors and you will find blocks of vacant row houses, their windows boarded, their stoops empty. Baltimore has lost roughly a third of its peak population since the 1950s, a decline driven by deindustrialization, white flight, suburban expansion, and decades of disinvestment. The poverty rate in the city is more than double the state average. Life expectancy in some Baltimore neighborhoods is lower than in many developing nations. The wealth of Maryland's suburbs and the hardship of its largest city are not separated by a mountain range or a cultural frontier. They are separated by a short drive on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. Most states in America can be described by a single dominant narrative. Texas is big, California is innovation, Florida is migration and reinvention, New York is density and ambition. Maryland resists this kind of reduction. It is not one thing. It is the space where many things collide, overlap, and refuse to resolve. Its smallness is precisely what makes it so volatile and so instructive. In a larger state, these contradictions would be separated by hundreds of miles of open space. They would exist in different media markets, different congressional districts, different time zones of experience. In Maryland, they are stacked on top of each other, pressed together by the same borders that were drawn in a 17th century charter and refined by a surveyor's line in the 18th. There is no room for these tensions to dissipate. One, they stay close. They stay visible. They stay unresolved. This is why Maryland is the opposite of every U.S. state, not because it lacks a coherent identity, but because it holds too many identities at once and refuses to let go of any of them. It is a border state that is not quite the border, a southern state that votes like the North, a wealthy state with deep pockets of deprivation, a diverse state with pockets of deep homogeneity, a small state with the geographic complexity of a continent, a place where the past is not a prologue but a permanent resident living next door to the future, sharing a driveway, arguing over the fence. Every American contradiction that other states experience in isolation, Maryland experiences simultaneously. The plantation and the factory, the suburb and the forgotten town, the immigrant and the waterman, the government campus and the boarded up block, the mountain and the marsh, the flag that holds two enemies in a single frame and dares you to look away. Other states contain pieces of America. Maryland contains the argument. It is not a microcosm. It is a compression chamber, and everything inside it is still under pressure. The Chesapeake still rises. The bay still divides. The map still looks like a broken hand reaching toward the Atlantic. And inside that hand, a state holds every version of America it has ever been, all at once, in a space barely wide enough to contain them. That is Maryland, and there is no other state like it.